Welcome everyone to Renaissance Lives, dedicated today to the life and the works of Paracelsus, and that will take the form of a conversation around the book Paracelsus, An Alchemical Life, which you can see the cover on the screen, with the author Bruce Moran. Bruce is emeritus professor from the University of Nevada at Reno, and I am sure that many of you are familiar with his extensive work on the intellectual and cultural history of science and early medicine. To discuss Paracelsus with Bruce, just a second. To discuss Paracelsus with Bruce, I am joined by Tilman Tappe, a historian of knowledge and currently a long-term Yates Fellow at the Warburg Institute, working on the intersection of medicine, alchemy, craft knowledge, and the printed book in the early modern period. So as usual, there would be a 1-hour conversation, which will be followed by a half-an-hour question and answer session where you, the audience, will have the opportunity to engage with the speakers. Now that I've very briefly presented the speaker, let me also very briefly introduce the subject and give you a sense of what you are in for. That is Paracelsus, 1493-1541. And he's indeed a particularly important yet very complex, elusive, and controversial figure in the history of knowledge. There are very many unusual things about Paracelsus. One that is quite symptomatic of him is that he was reputed for frequenting all sorts of people academics usually don't normally engage with. I mean, people from the so-called lowest classes. And so Paracelsus gathered his knowledge from popular as well as from learned tradition, because obviously he had a degree in medicine. And as such, he brought much changes in the practice of medicine, both in terms of the understanding of disease. He's a pioneer in understanding disease in a chemical way, if you want, rather than an imbalance between the four elements. And in that respect, he challenged the medical establishment, but his relationship to humanity and to the human body is much more interesting, also goes beyond theory, insofar as he refers to love as one of the pillars of the practice of medicine. So if you want, Paracelsus is an important actor in the early modern history of knowledge. He could be seen as reconnecting thinking and sensory experience, as well as reconnecting vernacular and learned tradition for the good and the relief of humans. But now, without further ado, I should leave Tilman to engage with Bruce with the first question. So Tilman, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois, for this kind introduction. Thank you, Bruce, for being here. And thank you for letting me have this conversation with you. I'm really looking forward to it. In a recent book review, I think it was Bill Amen who said that this book is such a little gem of a book, and I really think that's true. I mean, for a start, the series is beautifully produced, but you also managed to really distill a very complex personality into 7 very incredibly readable and very engaging chapters. So thank you for bringing Paracelsus to us in that way. And yes, why don't we start by asking Bruce, how did you get to Paracelsus in the first place, and how did you come to write this book? Because there are many other books about Paracelsus. Nonetheless, this is a very timely and a very readable one. How did you get to it?
Let me start by thanking you all for the invitation. It's great to be with you, and I love talking about Paracelsus. Paracelsus was never a focus of my specific research, but always in the background, I suppose, sort of a steady rhythm all through these many years. And it really is due to reaction books that I even considered writing about Paracelsus. And when I began to think about it, I really just wondered, well, why is Paracelsus so present? I mean, why is he so relevant in a cultural way? So I guess the book kind of presents not entirely a different path to Paracelsus, because there are others that are far more detailed than this one. But it does kind of work with a cultural, with a cultural scenery. What makes Paracelsus relevant all through these years? I mean, he could have been forgotten or just had a minor role. He could have been somebody like a, oh, I don't know, like a Caspar Schwenkfeld, kind of a radical religious figure or a radical figure in some way that kind of exists in specific contexts, but really doesn't stand out too much. But right from the beginning, Paracelsus stands out. And I think for me, trying to figure out culturally, that is to say, in terms of meaning, what the significance is at the time at which he was alive, and how maybe that still resonates today. This picture of Paracelsus is very big, and he's staring at me right now, so I'm beginning to think somebody's looking over my shoulder, and that's entirely appropriate. And incidentally, I remember years ago visiting the Warburg, and I know it was true at that time, I hope it still is, that books that are written today are on the same shelf or near the same shelf as books written by the subject of one's attention. So Paracelsus is nearby. All the mistakes that I make can be eagerly checked by others, and so the conversation goes on. I wrote this book with the title An Alchemical Life, and I guess I really, even at the very beginning, just as a way to get a conversation started, want to explain that. Because I find that Paracelsus is involved in a giant project. I mean, on the one hand, he really does have a sensitivity to what is actually a very old view that somehow the human being is that part of nature by which nature begins to have a consciousness of itself. But on the other hand, he also is explicit in saying that the human being also plays the role of completing the creation. So the creation is not just something that is done, but nature is in process. Nature is unfolding. Nature is constantly changing. And in completing the work of creation in a positive way, the human being plays a fundamental role and does that, and he's very, very specific about this, human being does that by means of making things. Because it is by making things that the processes of nature get finally understood. And so we have this view of nature, which is sort of unfolding, which is constantly changing. In a way, he more or less historicizes nature in the same way Galileo has been said to historicize the heavens. I mean, prior to Galileo's work, the notion of the superlunary spheres was considered to be unchanging. Galileo points out that things are changing. There are comets, there are new stars, there is a history to it. And Paracelsus notes that nature has a history too. So the way that you complete the work of nature by making things is an alchemical task. That's what alchemists do. They help perfect things. They take what nature gives and make something of it, make it better, help to perfect it. So that is his ambition, I think. That is one of his core beliefs. And that is why it is an alchemical life, because this life is constantly involved, as all lives ought to be, he would probably say, in the process of making things, so as to understand the processes of nature, the intelligence of nature, as a result, better.
I think so. I guess because we have this picture up, he's he is drawing on cultures that are already around, right? He's not
Yes.
necessarily making all of this up out of thin air. He
No.
sometimes likes to pretend that he does, and say how new everything is that he writes and how wrong everybody else is in particular.
That's
But
correct.
looking at this image, which comes from the title page of Hieronymus Brunswick's book on distillation, published in 1500, so when Paracelsus was something like 7 years old, I suppose. So a whole generation before him, people were already doing the work of perfecting nature through tools such as distillation. They weren't necessarily calling it alchemy. In fact, Brunswick, who wrote this book that the picture comes from, doesn't call it alchemy.
Yeah.
But he is drawing on a lot of practices that were already around. And one thing that's striking about that, I think, is that he draws on knowledge that is necessarily local, that is located in a certain spot. It is associated with certain people who know things through making, as you said. And often in the early modern period, people who know things are people who read and write books, and they deal with abstract universal knowledge. He's a lot less interested in that than most other people who write books in the period. He's much more interested in the artisans, in the alchemists, in the people who make things, in their particular local language even. He really has this idea that knowledge is local and that you have to travel to get there and to collect it. Maybe that's something that you can that you can follow up on.
Oh, gladly. I think he does. He does shift the epistemology quite a lot. In that way, I think he's quite revolutionary, even though he's certainly not alone. He revolutionizes as well language. So there's a connection between his thinking about how to get knowledge, what kind of knowledge should one get about what sorts of things, and how language is used to both connect with and communicate that knowledge. So this is a kind of epistemological, in terms of artisanry and traveling and localism, as well as a semantic change. I'd almost call it revolutionary, but then you would expect a huge consequence, but there isn't one for a very long time. So in terms of locality, that maps onto, of course, a view of nature in which different regions do different things. That's why you have to go visit them. There are diseases that only exist in certain places. And because nature is constantly changing, there are new diseases, and diseases that the ancient world had no knowledge of. And the means of confronting them is usually in terms of a local awareness of how nature is designed to provide the very stuff you need to make an adequate medicine in order to confront what then nature throws at you. This relates to impurities in nature that are there since the fall of Adam. So in that regard, you really have to find out what people are doing, how they're making things, and in a variety of places.
Yeah, I think, the diseases are local, and you said the cure can also be local. So I think we have a picture, one of the figures in your book, of a bath, which is a very nice example of how local nature provides cures that you can't find elsewhere. Because oftentimes these baths are not just any water, there are specific minerals in the water that are thought to be specific healing virtues in the water.
That's
that
right.
People are absorbing through their bodies. So you have to travel to these baths. But this is also one example where Paracelsus reveals himself to be somebody who does not shy away from people who are a little bit marginal, not only epistemologically speaking, that they're not sort of natural philosophers, but also morally and social, right? I mean, these bathhouses have different reputations in different places. but oftentimes it's not good, right? It's a place where people get naked. It's a place where people can sometimes pay for sexual favors or even get them for free because, you know, everyone is just there without their clothes on. There are a lot of sort of moral panic type stories around what happens in bathhouses in this time.
Well, yes. I mean, there's definitely a side to Paracelsus in which traveling and experiencing the world has a side to it that kind of touches on taboos or redefinitions of what might be considered curious. Would that be going too far? You know, the whole idea of going out and seeking new experience. Heavens above, if you were living around the time of Saint Augustine, that would be horrible, and you would not want to have new experiences. That's something like an insatiable desire to, I don't know, be lustful.
Yeah, to be lustful and to sort of be in the world with your body and your senses, right?
Yeah,
and what good
yeah,
ever comes of that? I mean, what you should do is retire and contemplate and so
absolutely.
on. And you know, that's 5th century Augustine, but it is very much alive and kicking, that attitude, during Paracelsus' time. So within his lifetime, there were humanists, especially of the Upper Rhine region, who, although they are starting to preach in German, which is sort of progressive for the time, they still speak about experience and travel as something that is bad. It puts your body in harm's way, and what you should do instead is contemplate.
It connects to things like avarice and lust and just simply not being content with what God has provided. So all of those things, and including the social side of it. You know, when I mentioned that, you know, the human being is involved in the act of completing nature, what makes Paracelsus's program so big is that he extends that not just to the material world, but to the social world as well. So that, you know, when you are out meeting bathers and others, you're meeting a lot of poor people. You're meeting people on the street. And this notion that the human being plays this alchemical role of perfecting an unfolding creation works in a social manner in terms of, well, trying to find a way to actually improve the world that people live in, and that creates poverty, and that is a kind of moral obligation. So this is a gigantic program, and you know, it gradually has come to light over a long time as really sophisticated Paracelsus scholars read more and collect more and discern which is authentic and which is less so in terms of his writings. But I think that overall there is a definite sense of being with people in order to reform or change the situations of their lives, as well as the material world around them.
Yeah,
of course,
and I think, sorry, with the social aspect, I think we can sort of speculate that may be coming from a place of personal experience for Paracelsus as well, right? Because he is born not a free man, but he is born a bondsman or serf.
That's
so
right.
He comes from a place where he is not his own man, and he is not free. And I think, Francois, we have one of the images, a printed portrait of Paracelsus, where Bruce can translate the Latin for us, because it says something about you know, being your own person, which is important to him. But there it is. Where I wanted to go with this is, so we can see Paracelsus as a kind of, you know, social reformer. Even he spends time with people. It's part of improving the world. He also travels. He's interested in local knowledge. So can we see him as a kind of environmentalist as well? Is that part of his big reform?
I'm not quite sure about the term.
It's a very modern term to think about humans in an environment. In the early modern period, people didn't think like that.
I don't mind if we use terms that historical actors would never have recognized. I think that's okay to at least have a conversation about. I think he is, how would I say? I mean, in terms of what is important in nature, I think he emphasizes a spiritual aspect to it. In other words, he often refers to the shell of things as opposed to the true natural and efficacious part of things. And in terms of medicaments, this is particularly clear. You know, it's not the outside of the medication that's the important thing. That's the shell. It's the active spiritual virtue within. And so Paracelsus is in this place in which what might be considered true nature is, well, invisible. I mean, it has a lot to do. Yeah, there are lots of material objects, but what powers them, what gives them their being, and what tells them what to do if they grow, or if they do anything at all, even exist. That's something which is of a spiritual, cosmic sort of thing. So I think environmentally, if we use the term, I think he's very well connected to a sense of the world with hidden powers, packed with hidden powers, and hidden spiritual beings even, that sort of dramatize the omnipotence of the creator and that are available in order to make things and to make things happen. As I was just talking to you about this, I was thinking, I started writing this book pre-COVID, and I'm thinking, gosh, if Paracelsus were around, he would be absolutely delighted by, not the horror of this pandemic, certainly, but the response to it. I mean, isn't it interesting that just on the eve of this arrival of a new virus, Moderna or other genetic engineering people had sort of put together a thing called messenger RNA, where now you could provide a blueprint for the protein antibodies that are needed. He would have thought, that's just it. We make things, and so we're ready for the impurities that are in nature, and we can deal with them. I think he would have just simply said, see? I don't know if that's helpful.
If I may just jump in here to ask you a question. At the moment, I'm very interested in Palissy, who could be characterized as an environmentalist, etc. And one thing that he says is that even the vegetal world has the ability to suffer. Does Paracelsus extend sensation precisely to the vegetal world, or even to rocks and stones? Because this is something quite present in Palissy. If trees are being cut poorly, and they should be fixed like you fix an arm when you are a surgeon, for instance. Do you get this kind of empathy with the world in Paracelsus?
Maybe someone else knows better about that, Francois. I don't know quite how to answer that, at least in my experience. The closest that it comes is that, look, there is an intelligence, there is a sense of real kind of relationship between things. This maybe connects to magic and Ficino and others, but things are attracted to one another, and they are because there is a relationship of some kind, and that is a spiritual relationship in terms of Ficino, and more with Paracelsus, it's an astra, something initially from the heavens that had to do with the way the world was created, the great world first, and then the minor or the world of people. So I wouldn't think that it would be too far-fetched to think that that was somewhere embedded in Paracelsus's thinking, but I can't think of a specific place off the top of my head where that happens. So I kind of have to backpedal a bit, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Let's put it that way.
Bruce, there was something that really resonated with me when you said that Paracelsus would have been delighted with the idea of vaccines, because we've been making things, because it was sort of already there in the things that we know how to make. But also, I thought, because it's such a good example of the disease being very close to the cure. Yes. Right? So that in a vaccine, I mean, different vaccines work in different way, but the mRNA was originally part of a virus, and some vaccines give you dead bits of virus and so on. So we have this sort of idea that really, in many ways, goes back to Paracelsus. You know, if we want to pin one thing that maybe was actually original about him, maybe it is that idea that you can find the cure close to the disease. Because before, in traditional sort of Galenic medicine, in traditional academic medicine, the opposite was the case, right? That you had a humoral imbalance, and that's your disease. Your disease might be hot if it's a fever or something, which means the remedy needs to be cold. The two sort of cancel out as much as possible, and then your balance is restored. With Paracelsus, we have a different story. And of course, that idea lives on in the name homeopathy, which still exists and does things slightly differently now. But do you want to say a little bit about that idea?
Sure. I don't know. I may be just telling everybody what they already know, but yeah, that's quite right. I mean, the diseases have their own etiologies for Paracelsus. They're not whole body humoral imbalances, the way ancient medical traditions had thought of them. And having their own specific etiologies, they also have their own specific cures. And oftentimes those are very closely connected to the types of illness that one experiences in different places. So in that regard, yeah, I mean, this is the revolutionary side to it. But that also means that you need a new language, that you cannot find medical terms in the humanist way of looking back to ancient texts. Things change so much that you have to constantly be concerned with a new vocabulary. And so semantically, nature and its unfolding requires a kind of new semantic outlook. And I have to think, and while I'm saying that, I have to think that German is just perfect for this. I mean, because German, 16th century German is syntactically unruly to just kind of, if you read the letters I read from the period, some words have Latin endings just so that you know where to put them in the sentence. You know, is it the object? Is it the subject?
Well, and a sentence is a fluid thing as well, right?
Yeah,
I mean, oftentimes, I'm sure if you look at Francois's wonderful background, which is actually a Paracelsian publication, if you just look at his Zoom screen background, you can try to figure out where the sentences begin and end. And with people like Paracelsus, who sort of rant and probably dictated, and possibly while they were drunk, that's the kind of language you get. But of course, this is the great age of the vernacular,
yes,
becoming a language not only of stories, but also in a serious way, a language of knowledge.
And that, of course, maps onto everything else we've been discussing. So now you need a new language, and one that can change, and one that is fluid. And so vernacular languages that had been fairly well ignored, at least in terms, many times in terms of printed sources, become possibly a way to do that. I mean, the ongoing non-sentence of some German published writing, I think opens the door not only to editors to later on think they really understand and put it in the way they really want it to be, but it also indicates that kind of unsettledness of the relationship between experience and knowing. And we might have a little bit to say about that, because I once took a crack at translating some Paracelsus. One thing I did publish is Hebarius, but I found myself waking up in the middle of the night worrying about it, so I never did it again. And I did translate the Labyrinthus, which is another part of the Corinthian writing, and put it in a drawer, and I've never opened it since. But in that text, he spends a good deal of effort trying to explain what he means by experience. And it isn't passive observation. It isn't basically like going someplace and looking. It is going someplace, looking, possibly making, but then understanding through process, the intelligence of what one is looking at, and in a spiritual sort of way. And the weird thing about it is, what makes this all happen is, this sounds very trite, but it's dead center with Paracelsus. The thing that makes this possible is love. You have to love nature. You have to love your subject, because then you are loving God. And then God will reveal to you a lot of what Paracelsus describes, well, drunk or otherwise, is a revelation. And it is the light of nature, he calls it. He refers to that as the Ablauschung der Natur, that is to say, kind of listening in on nature. But what, so you kind of overhear what nature is doing by participating in the processes of making things. But that doesn't come to everybody. That is that you are selected by God, and God is involved in this equation in a way of reinforcing the love that one has for the subject being observed or being treated. It's very, I mean, as much as I would say Augustine would have been horrified at the lack of humility of this person, I also find that there's some real Augustinian stuff here that has to do with love and the unity of being, that has to do with truth. Those three things, pretty basic Augustinian things. And Paracelsus is a product of cloister schools. So there can be a connection possibly, although in another way, Augustine would really think that he was following the rules at all. So in that sense, in treating a patient, that's why you need love, because what is really going on, the process by which a symptom has appeared, is not going to become known to you otherwise. This is very much about revelation. And that's just one of the ironies. You've got somebody who is directing you to go and travel, turn the pages of nature with your feet, go and look, go and be very precise about it, describe what you see, but try thereby to understand the actual spiritual workings and virtues of a thing. And that happens with the final little piece of the keystone being put in place, namely the love of nature and God. And that means human beings as well.
Great. Bruce, you already mentioned a few of Paracelsus's writings, including the Labyrinthus, including the Corinthian writings. And I think we should talk a little bit about Paracelsus and books by or not by Paracelsus, because at the moment we're sort of making it sound like Paracelsus was somebody who wrote books that we can read and then we know what he thought. And of course, the story is much, much more complicated than that. There are many things that aren't by Paracelsus. There is now a recognized field of pseudo-Paracelsus studies. You know it's going well if you know the pseudo version of the author has its own little group of dedicatees. And of course, maybe a good way into this is to talk about the text by Paracelsus, which we think was genuinely by Paracelsus, that you use to actually structure your book, because we've sort of veered away from your book a little bit. It has 7 chapters that correspond to the 7 defenses by Paracelsus, in which he defends himself. So sort of characteristically, in the title, he's already on the back foot and sort of picking a fight with somebody. And yet it was, he probably wrote it, but it was published after his death. So how does this writing, his book, The 7 Defenses, how does that sort of embody who he is, and how is it typical of Paracelsian writings and what happens to them?
Well, the reason I chose it is because I had this sort of cultural sense of what I was doing, and I really like The 7 Defenses because it is very much a piece of reflection. He's an older man. It's written in the late 1530s. You know, even the portrait that might have been added, we think it not the one you see, but the other one like it, may have been intended for the Corinthian writings. And it really shows him as having weathered quite a bit over the years. So I thought it was a really interesting way of Paracelsus sort of nearing the end of his life. Of course, he didn't know it at the time, but he was getting close to the end of days for him. Thinking about the things that have happened. And he has suffered. He has been opposed. He has been humiliated. All of that quite natural, incidentally, for the kind of macho masculine writing that is academic writing in the 16th century. But it's really had an effect. And he's, I think, given as good as he's gotten. And what he kind of is doing is he's involved in the work of clearing space for something new. So there's some destruction to what he's doing. Kind of a cultural clearing. You want to build your log cabin, you first have to knock down some trees. So anyway, never mind. Anyway, he is involved in this type of thing in the 7 Defenses, and the accusations against him, he refutes them. And I think that's why and in terms of trying to figure out what kind of meaning he has for us, I began to wonder, well, look, there is this sense in which, he reportedly says of himself that I am alone, I am foreign, and I am different. Wow, did that ever speak to me? I feel that way sometimes too. And so the 7 defenses are 7 kind of little insertions about how this very different, foreign, and often alone individual is confronted with a world that really hates him, hates his social origins, hates what he has to say, and what he says in return. And I just found that to be really significant in a way that might resonate way beyond the individual himself. So that's where that all came from. So I like the 7 defenses, and it is part, the Labyrinthus was also to be part of the Corinthian writings, a little treatise on Tartar, and I think a little chronicle of things. But this one we know was going to be written or was composed by Paracelsus. And as you say, already, immediately, there's a time after his death, a few things appear. And then the editors start taking over, Toxites and Dorn and others. Toxites says already in the 1570s, there's a lot that has the name Theophrastus, but that he didn't write. Mm. And later, I think it was the Lutheran theologian Nicholas Hunius, says, he was also a philologist at Wittenberg, and he says, actually, everything that is mystical that is under Paracelsus' name was written by somebody else, because stylistically, it's all wrong. Mm. So the big questions. And then the editors criticize one another because they don't have it right. And then, you get into the big collections of Husserl and others later on. And then as we're finding out, the new historiography is focused on kind of figuring out what is a forgery, what is a modification. So here's the editor gets a manuscript and it says 10 books about X. But the manuscript only has 8 books. So we got to find 2 more. Well, where do we get them? Oh, and where do we put them? So there are questions not only about outright fakes and forgeries, but then changes that are happening right away. In his lifetime, Paracelsus, maybe somebody can help me here, but there's a little book about syphilis. There's something about bathing. There's the big one, of course, is his great surgery. But isn't it interesting? In that book, the preface is fascinating. He's going to write a surgery which really doesn't have much to do with surgery. It has a lot more to do with making medicines. But he says, I'm really trying to figure out the fundamental of this thing, this art, this medical art. And I'm not sure there is one. I'm not even sure it's an art. But, so this goes back to Hippocrates, who's trying to figure out if medicine can be a techne or something else. Paracelsus isn't sure. Maybe it has more to do with prayer and love than it has to do. So most things just happen by accident, don't they? Mm. So maybe he's even wondering. But there are texts that are considered to be not by Paracelsus at all. Some have been considered not to be by him, and then now are considered to be partly by him, but maybe not entirely. So yeah, you're quite right. I mean, it's sort of a hodgepodge, and you've got to be careful. I mean, I try to be very careful, but I get things wrong too. And that's why I like the Warburg, because somebody someday is going to maybe read my book, if it's there, and maybe then read somebody else and say, oh, Moran got it wrong, right? Moran's wrong there. But that's just fine. This is a conversation, and I'm just, I'm trying to add a voice to it.
Yes. Well, as you say, if we look at Paracelsus's books, we read somebody who is made up by others, who is made up by his editors. And of course, that's something that continues throughout history. It is sort of hard to pinpoint the real Paracelsus. I think, maybe the Seven Defenses, that's where we see something like the realist Paracelsus that we have reflecting at the end of his life. But of course, he also made himself up, right?
That's
I mean,
right.
starting with his name, do you want to take it from there and then sort of maybe tell us a little bit about how he really fashions a persona?
Well, he really signs himself Theophrastus von Hohenheim. I mean, and later on, his father gives him the name Theophrastus. I sure wish there would be a wonderful discovery of a cache of manuscripts that would tell us more about his father, because I think that individual is key in getting Paracelsus oriented in the world. But unfortunately, there is very, very little. We know a little bit about him, but not very much. He does make himself up. It is part of, possessing himself. And, others make things up too. So I'm quite aware of that. And I have attempted at least to stay clear of what is legendary and what I present. I don't know if I have done that absolutely, but I do think it's important to separate what really cannot be verified through good historical evidence, but which somehow has gotten into the grand narrative of Paracelsus. And you find, I mean, there are, Franz Hartmann, who was a theosophist and an associate of Helena Blavatsky, and I mean, he writes a biography of Paracelsus, and he has Paracelsus being captured by the Tartars and then escorting the son of the Khan to Constantinople and getting the Philosopher's Stone from somebody. That's not in my book. So there are ways in which making him up begins with Paracelsus and continues with others. With Hartmann, the agenda is, oh, this sounds so much like Indic philosophy. I really want him to be connected to that world. So yeah, a little footnote that I find in Van Helmont, I'll make a big deal of.
Yeah.
So those are that unfortunately comes with the territory, and I have tried to either by silence or some other means to not jump on the bandwagon of, I mean, because others you can find discussions of Paracelsus in which he's a student in Vienna, and then in Tübingen, and then in Ferrara. Well, maybe, but I don't know where the evidence for that is. So I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm just not going to be making it worse by repeating it.
And I guess, Paracelsus doesn't make things easier for us because, I mean, he would probably be delighted by that Constantinople story. Like, I mean, that sounds like just the kind of thing that he would actually make up himself and put in one of his writings. Yeah. As he sometimes does, right? I mean, I think you point out in your book, he claims to have traveled all these places, but then he talks about Stockholm being in Denmark, and just sort of slight inaccuracies where you realize that, maybe...
Primarily, he's active in what would be Germany, Switzerland, Southern Austria. And I think if there's ever a home for him, it really is in Carinthia, Canton. It's where he goes with his father initially. He seems to always come back there. Doesn't always stay long. And that's the thing, along with, and no wonder the Romantics loved him. I mean, he's just simply never at home. He's homesick all the time, potentially, like many seem to want to be. There's this sense of being kind of aware of the world through your own. I mean, the world is there not as a result of, but as in an interrelationship with your own self-consciousness. So the subjective and the objective are all together entwined. Foreign, different, and alone. I mean, what better romantic figure could you want? He's just perfect.
Well, that gets us into the kind of question about the sort of later afterlives of Paracelsus. You know, once his various editors are more or less done with him, we get adaptations in film and in art. And you mentioned the Romantics who loved him. The Nazis also claimed him as their own. So that there must be something about Paracelsus that resonates with a lot of quite different people.
Yeah. Well, I think you can find in Paracelsus something that sort of resonates with your own experiences of the world, perhaps. I mean, first, he's considered to be a very forceful spokesperson for change in the context of medicine. I mean, that is sort of where the groundwork begins with Paracelsus and Walter Pagel and others in English, but German scholars really have emphasized, look, we are dealing with someone who has taken on both ancient medical traditions, but also the academic framework for learning about medicine. This is not a small thing. So Paracelsus is there are humors that he refers to in his writings, but he's not a humoralist. He sees that illness comes about in a very different way. Illnesses have our own specific being and occur in specific places in the body, requiring specific types of medications, and in a very, very intense way that maps onto signatures and correspondences in nature, so that you must look very carefully, and once inspired by God to overhear what nature is doing, you can make useful medicines to make things better. So he does have that medical root, but I'm thinking that there's also the social side of Paracelsus. That comes through in the movie by Pabst, where it's a Nazi film, but he's sort of a man of the people in that film. Maybe this is the social side of National Socialism. He's a great man, but he's afflicted, and he's afflicted, by in his own writings. I think in the Labyrinthus, he pretty much rails against the Welsh, the Southern peoples, Italians and others who criticize Germans. So you can find something national there in terms of language and so forth. There is the sense of the great man. I love some of the portraits. Unfortunately, one portrait I could not find. I don't think it exists anymore. It's what Henry Wellcome had commissioned for the library that in the Wellcome Trust now. I've been all over the collection. I still haven't found it. There's just a photograph of it. It looks like either Moses or Luther throwing a book into the fire.
We have it in the images, I think.
Yeah, it is in the images.
It's in the book. Yeah.
There's a sense of this hero figure. But I don't think Paracelsus really wanted to be a hero. I think he just wanted he recognizes how messy stuff is. And I don't know if I did an adequate enough job of conveying that. But the world is a very messy place. Nevertheless, he gets made into these images of the heroic, the rebellious, the father figure of medicine, throwing out the old, without too much further detail about what ought to take its place, I might add. So there is all of that. You can find something, but and that really underscores the initial question I had, like why is he so present? What culturally is there that creates this significance for this I consider him an alchemical figure, and I think his life in terms of bringing changes or insisting upon the human being as the way that nature completes itself, to be an alchemical life.
Yeah, and the transformation doesn't stop.
No,
it
no,
never stops because he's such a multifaceted person that.
Well, I will tell you. I mean, getting back to the, one thing after the war, poor Paracelsus was made into such a figure of the Blut und Boden kind of literature that there was a sense in which, gosh, do we really want to have any more of this? And bless his heart, Kurt Goldammer really tried to rehabilitate Paracelsus after the war, but he had to be very careful. And in this little Reclam book that came out from Licht der Natur, it always amazed me. There's one little part where he says, and then the text breaks off, and then it's ... with brackets, and it says, and here Paracelsus castigates Southern peoples, or something like that. Well, if you look at what it is about the Jews, he took a passage out that had to do with Paracelsus hating Jews. Well, that wasn't going to be allowed, maybe, if that book ever wanted to see print, or if he ever, so I don't think one way or the other about it, but I use it as an indication of just how Paracelsus collides with the present and the situations in the present, and what is necessary sometimes, or thought necessary to do in order to maintain him in the present.
Well, as we're reaching the present, it's already 30, and I think it's time to open the discussion to the audience. So I would encourage you to raise your hand using the React tab at the bottom of your screen, and then I will ask you to unmute, or you can also send me question in the chat. While you're thinking of your question, I wanted to ask you, Bruce, what it means to be Paracelsian. But from this conversation, I understand that everyone can pull Paracelsus to themselves. And I was actually very struck on what you say about language as part of the cure, because some people who would love to hear that language is part of the cure are Freud and Lacan. It's one of the foundation of psychoanalysis. I don't think that Paracelsus is an ancestor of that, but there seems to be a seed that there is some cure in language, as well as in the understanding of the chemistry of the body.
Oh yes. I mean, spiritually, language can kill you. It can make you sick. That's a wonderful side of Paracelsus, where he's dealing with the power of the word. In a magical sense, but I'm not. He is very interesting in that he will take what is considered to be madness and look for a material cause for it, and a material or chemical way of dealing with it. Nevertheless, given the kind of spiritual side that is communicated through the use of words, words hurt, words can harm, words can injure, and words can also help cure. Now, about Paracelsianism, that's really a tough issue. I mean, on the one hand, it means everything, and on the other, it can mean nothing. I mean, if we want to think of Paracelsians as those who follow the actual texts of Paracelsus, the unambiguous sorts of remains of this author, well, I don't know if there's too much to talk about. If we mean just, anyone who uses, who thinks of the body as a chemical instrument and considers illness to have a chemical basis to them and wants to cure by means of chemistry, well, then I think we can include a great many more writers. Some have begun to think of not just Paracelsianism, but Paracelsianisms, that is to say plural, just like there are Aristotelianisms. There are also those who actually use terms like Paracelsian in the 16th and 17th century. And when they do use the term Paracelsista, they don't mean something nice by it. This is a use of a term which is, and sometimes there's one individual in particular, even in a discussion of Paracelsus, somehow he slips in. His name is Andreas Libavius, and when you read what he writes, you find that there is nothing good about this, since it is destroying the tradition of ages and the academic sense of logic, and replacing logic with magic. And he refers to the neo-Paracelsista. So the use of the actual term in situ is negative. So this is a historical reference, and then it's fine. It's a historical term. It is no one who wrote in the tradition of Paracelsus, at least initially, really called him or herself Paracelsian. But historically, Alan Debus writes about the English Paracelsians and the French Paracelsians, and then there's what Tella and Kuhlmann have done about the corpus Paracelsisticum. Okay, so well, we can find a convenient term to think about it, but I like to think about those kinds of terms as in the same way that we use references to, say, longitude and latitude, right? They're necessary to get around, but you're not going to bump into one, right? You don't have to say, oh, look out, you may trip over that line, and it's not there. But it helps you get around. And the problem with using terms like Paracelsian is you don't know where they're drawn. There's no hard and fast rule. In fact, Tella basically says that, look at the very language that he uses just defies institutionalization. You cannot create anything definite in an institutional way around Paracelsus or Paracelsian. And then, just kind of going back, not to return too much to this, but there's a real definite sense in which, since so much depends upon revelation, how does this ever become didactic at all? How do you ever teach the method? You can teach the result of a revelation, but you can't. This is what Owen Hanaway was so important for pointing out. As a didactic method, you can't teach what Paracelsus says you need to have in order to learn about the world.
I think we're reaching the end of the session, so that's my opportunity to thank you so much, Bruce.
Thank you very much. No, this was a delight. It was a true delight. Thank you so much for inviting me. I just can't be more grateful.
Okay. Thank you for having me. It was such a fascinating conversation to have with you, Bruce. Thank you. It's great to see you.
All right, great to see you all.
Okay.
And write to me if you know, I'm available. Okay, bye everybody.
Thank you, everyone. The next
Thank
session
you.
will be in March on Tycho Brahe with Professor Charles Burnett and J.R. Christensen. So thank you again, and good night, everyone. Bye.